Big Seance Podcast, Episode 74. My presentation from the American Hauntings Fall Festival, an announcement about an upcoming live seance, a new Spectral Edition, and the top 15 reasons to befriend a paranormal nerd today. Welcome to the Big Seance Podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the seance. Hello there, Paranerds. I'm so excited to catch up with you. As you heard from the top of the show, I have a jam-packed episode for you. So first, my special announcement. Mark your calendars, because Karen A. Dahlman, along with her board partner, Rodney, will be joining me live once again, but this time for a seance for the Halloween season. This is going to be on October 14th at 7 p.m. Central Time. We're so excited about this. So here's what you need to do. Details are still being worked out regarding what online platform we'll be using, if there will be a live chat, things like that. But you'll for sure be able to find us at bigseance.com/live. And even now, you can go to bigseance.com/live and find details about the evening. And there's more. I'm sitting here with 2 copies of Karen's book, Spirits of Ouija. I know many of you have already read it because it's awesome. But if you haven't, here's how you can get one of those copies. Send an email to me, Patrick, at bigseance.com with the subject line, Halloween Seance, and include a question for the live seance. It can be a general question for Karen or a question for the board. And I'll send Karen's book to the first 2 people who email with a question for that seance. Now, I realize that some of you may have a question for the seance, but you already have Karen's book. Well, just let me know in the email, and I'll award the book to the next in line. That sounds fair, doesn't it? So to recap, on Friday, October 14th, there will be a live seance for the Halloween season with Karen A. Dahlman. Go to bigseance.com/live to stay up to date on all the details, and you'll most likely be able to watch right there on that page once you get to October 14th. But send questions to me, Patrick, at bigseance.com with the subject line Halloween Seance, and the first 2 listeners to do that will receive a copy of Karen's book, Spirits of Ouija. So excited about that. Okay, here's Tim Prasil with another installment of the Spectral Edition.
Welcome to the audio version of Spectral Edition. I'm Tim Prasil. You know, my website is titled The Merry Ghost Hunter, so naturally, if I find a ghost report that deals with a ghost hunter, I'm very happy. And this one was published on February 19th of 1898 in the Copper County Evening News. That's a newspaper from Calumet, Michigan. The haunting, however, is set in Maine, and the headline of this article is Maine's Haunted Town. Every other house in Easton has a ghost of some kind. It is doubtful if any town in all New England has more ghosts and haunted houses than Easton, Maine. It may well be called a haunted town. Although the citizens are sensible and well-to-do farmers, with all sincerity and almost to a man, they vouch for the truth of many tales of remarkable and startling supernatural visitations. For years, one of the houses in the center of town has stood vacant. Several attempts have been made to occupy it, but no one has ever succeeded in remaining within the faded walls for any length of time. One brave and skeptical youth recently determined upon an investigation, and as he is the scion of one of the first families and tells his story openly, it is believed in implicitly by all Easton people. The first night after he had gone to bed, leaving the lights burning, the shade of a great dog came into his room right through the closed door. Advancing to the bedside, the canine specter regarded him savagely. He started up, and the phantom dissolved into thin air. But the courage of the investigator failed him not, and he determined to brave it out. Before he could get to sleep, however, a woman all in white, with disordered black hair hanging over the face, made her appearance, weeping and wringing her hands. This vivid apparition was accompanied by still more gruesome signs from below. The heavy clanking of a chain reverberated through the still house, and soon deep groans were heard from various points. By this time he was thoroughly frightened, and getting out of bed, he went down to the dining room, where he remained the rest of the night, listening to the noises made by his ghostly companions. The house has never been entered since. Another Easton man of undoubted veracity claims to have seen a phantom woman in broad daylight when the sun was shining brightly and no thoughts of the ghostly were in his mind. It was in his own home, too, where all was cheerful and nothing existed to put him in a morbid state. She had a remarkably white face, luminous dark eyes, and masses of dark hair hung in wild disorder about her face. He raised his eyes and saw the phantom advancing toward him. So real did it seem that he thought she was a mortal woman. He rose and stepped toward her, when she gave him one long searching look and vanished into empty space. The piercing glance of those eyes, which, he says, seemed to penetrate his very soul, haunts him still, although he never has had a repetition of the ghostly visitant. This story is attributed to the San Francisco Examiner. That's down at the bottom. As I mentioned, this was published in a Michigan newspaper, and it's all about the ghosts in Maine. So this shows how, at least during this period of American history, ghost stories would travel, very much like folk stories. And I think that goes a long way toward explaining what these ghost reports are all about. They're just really interesting stories that people want to share. I have close to 300 of these ghost reports, all authentic newspaper articles published in U.S. newspapers between 1865 and 1918. I post one each Wednesday on my website, which is called The Merry Ghost Hunter. I hope you stop by.
You're listening to the Big Seance Podcast with Patrick Keller. Look for us on iTunes and be sure to check out bigseance.com for more discussion.
International Podcast Day is September 30th, and you can help spread the word. International Podcast Day is dedicated to promoting podcasting worldwide. You may be asking, what can I do to get involved? It's pretty simple. First, head over to internationalpodcastday.com and check the suggestions. Second, use hashtag Podcast Day to join in the conversation. Remember September 30th. Now, let's start the conversation.
This summer, Troy Taylor asked me to speak at his American Hauntings Fall Festival, and I was very happy and excited to accept the invite. So this last weekend, my partner and I took off on a road trip to Jacksonville, Illinois, where the festival was being held. We'd never been to Jacksonville. It's really a beautiful place, and actually the whole drive there from the St. Louis area is beautiful, with lots of historic towns on the way, and the weather was perfect. I couldn't stop thinking about how beautiful it probably is a little later in the fall once all the leaves have changed. Might be worth a trip again. This year, they held the Fall Festival in this huge pavilion that was built in 1904. And it's in a large, beautiful park filled with other structures like gazebos and things like that look to be about the same age. It was really a cool place. We met some new Paranerds, including the cutest couple. that I think I could have talked to for hours. So I want to give a shout out to Keith and Felicia. Well, along with the exhibits and the vendors, Troy and Lisa Taylor gave a presentation about some of the history and haunts of Jacksonville. And Renee Cruz, who also spoke at Haunted America Conference, she gave a presentation. All three of those folks have an awesome history with the paranormal. I also picked up Troy's latest book, which I'm very excited about. This one's called Ghosts of the Prairie, History and Hauntings of Central Illinois. Well, a few people had been asking me lately if I planned on recording my presentation to share with you. And since I thought that was a great idea, I wired myself up to my own microphone to capture it all, good or bad. And I spoke last, and as you'll probably be able to tell in the audio, I was very nervous, as this was my first time being a speaker at a paranormal event. But I enjoyed it and was so happy to have the opportunity. So I want to thank Troy for the invite and for the very kind things he had to say when he introduced me. So the audio you're about to hear came from the lapel mic on my shirt. But because of the other microphone for the room there, some of it sounds a little blasty. So I've tried to clean that up a bit and pull the volume down, and hopefully you'll still enjoy it. I've done some minor editing for time, and because there are some things I'm sure you've heard me say many times before. I also shared around 20 PowerPoint slides behind me as I talked. So if something happens, you're missing a bit of context, that might be why. It's because you're not seeing the PowerPoint. My timing was a little off, so I spent too much time talking, I think, at the beginning about books and some of my earlier experiences. And I would have loved to have spent more time discussing EVP, my wrapper, and a few other stories, but I'll still consider the whole thing a big success. When I share the EVP samples in the presentation, it was really hard for the audience to hear. They did hear it, but I'm going to go ahead and insert the actual recordings here in this podcast episode, so you'll hear it so much better than the audience was able to. So if it sounds a little different when those EVP clips pop in, that's why. So here we go. At the beginning, I made a joke about a disco ball. There was this huge disco ball hanging from the ceiling in the pavilion, and I think opening with a joke made me kind of feel better. All right, so am I allowed to pour the tea for myself? I think I will.
Anyway, I asked Patrick if he would come and do a presentation on some of the interviews and some of the things that he has done with the show, so I'm glad he could be here with us today. So I'm going to introduce you to Patrick Keller.
Thank you,
sir.
You rock. I was hoping that Troy could get the disco ball going for my presentation as the last one, but looks like it would be pretty cool. I wonder, I was telling my partner Joe, I wonder how many proms have been in this building since 1904. It must be a crazy number of proms. My name is Patrick Keller, as he just said, and my main gig is a teacher. I'm a music teacher, and so I kind of actually have kind of teacher voice the last couple of weeks. So I'm glad this microphone's kind of pumping out some audio right now. I've taught vocal music for the past 15 years, and for part of the day, for most of those years, I've also taught class piano, which is kind of cool. And then the last 2 years, I was able to have a hand in creating a really cool class for my middle school students called Music Production and Technology. And so we do cool things like film scoring and just producing music digitally. And we get to do, of course, because I'm a giant podcast nerd, obviously, I worked in some podcasting things with them. And so that's kind of what I do for my main gig. My first passion was music. But when I'm not there, when I'm not with kids, when I'm not at school, trust me, my head is in the paranormal. That's kind of my other big passion. But the reason I am here is because Troy asked me to come speak. I'm really excited. And I've got notes today. I'm a giant nerd because I've spoken in front of hundreds of parents and kids, in 15 years, but I've never spoken publicly in a group about the paranormal yet. So I'm going to have to use notes because I want to make sure I don't skip anything. So it's also the teacher in me, I guess. How many of you can say that you listen to at least a podcast and you know what a podcast is? Can you put your hand up? Awesome. Okay. How many of you really for real are like, for real, I don't know what a podcast is. I'm lost. Be honest. Okay, cool. You are who I'm talking to at this very moment. A podcast, I'm a big promoter of podcasts in general. I don't listen to the radio anymore, really. I watch fewer hours of TV than I used to because I have like 50 podcasts that I listen to regularly, and sometimes it's too many and I end up having to just grit my teeth and delete them because I've got so many and I get behind. But a podcast is basically audio content. There are video podcasts too. But most podcasts are audio content that it's cool. It's like a DVR. You can pause it. I always tell my kids, when I drive to school in the morning, I'm listening to a podcast. I can almost promise you. And when I get to the parking lot, to the school, I press pause, go in, do my job, teach, leave, go home, press play again, and I didn't miss anything. And when you are listening to the radio in the morning, morning radio shows, or they're interviewing some star that's in town or something, and you get to school and you have to miss the rest of it. So I promise you there is a podcast in any possible nerdy genre or niche that you are interested in. And that probably includes underwater basket weaving or something as crazy like that. So I want to encourage you, if you've never checked out a podcast, if you've got a device, some kind of smartphone or an iPad or a tablet, or even an old school chunky computer, you can subscribe to podcasts. If you subscribe to a podcast, it sucks right to your phone every time the producer of that podcast releases it. And you can listen to it with earbuds. In my car, I put it on Bluetooth. I don't even have to even think about it. It's really cool. It's changed my life. That's really nerdy to say. But podcasts have so changed my life. So you'll hear a little more later about my podcast. And if the audio if we can hear the audio, I'm going to put the microphone up to the projector. I've got a video at the end that's kind of a highlights reel from interviews I've done on my podcast, including Mr. Troy Taylor. So that'll be at the end, and then you can maybe decide if you want to be a podcast nerd, if you haven't been. All right, so it took me quite a while after Troy asked me to figure out exactly what I wanted to talk about today. I've never really thought of myself as being an expert on anything in the paranormal world, for sure. I have, in the last decade, kind of, dabble's not really a good word, but experimented with different areas in the paranormal, researched different areas, just read a lot, listened to a lot of podcasts, and that led me down to starting my own podcast, and before that, a blog, and I'll get to all of that, I guess. I kind of jumped from one topic to the next, and so I'm really OCD as well, so when I jump into something, I tend to jump into it hard. So I've got a lot to say, I guess, about the paranormal, but I don't know that many people would say they're an expert in the paranormal field. It's hard to say you're an expert in the paranormal field, things you can't see and can't prove, and all of that. A while back, I began calling myself and my listeners Paranerds, and so that comes up a lot in my podcast, and so you'll be seeing that. I think it's a term that really fits for me and my listeners, so I just decided to call this Becoming a Paranerd. What makes my involvement in the paranormal really different and interesting is that I did not grow up with experiences of the paranormal. Probably, I'm guessing many of you are here today or have an interest in the paranormal, and it probably goes back to some experience that you had, I'm guessing, even if it's just a tiny experience. I did not have that. Sometimes I think back and I try really hard. I'm like, could there have possibly been one thing? Did I have an imaginary friend? Is there something, that could have been paranormal? But I can't think of anything really. So it's really only been, I'm kind of a late Paranerd bloomer, the last decade, really. The seance for me is just kind of a metaphor that symbolizes, our search for answers and wanting to communicate with those on the other side, those of us that want to do that anyway. Wanting to find answers, proof, wanting to learn about people who have passed on, wanting to communicate with our loved ones maybe. There's different reasons why people would want to do that. And to me, the seance, because a lot of people even today have asked me, do you do seances? Is that what this is all about? Well, I've been to a few seances and I've done different experiments and stuff like that you could consider seances. But for me, it's just, a lot of people, when they see the word seance, it just takes them to visualizing the old days of spiritualism and a Victorian parlor and candles and some crazy flamboyant medium, and that's where my mind goes. And I love that picture. And so I've always tried to create that atmosphere with my content, with my podcast. I don't know if I always succeed at that, but that's kind of always what I'm going for. So I kind of feel like my place in the paranormal has always been to just share my journey and ask the questions that I think other people might want to ask. And, share my nerdy experiences with experimenting and the people I meet at events like this and researchers and authors and investigators. And so it's just kind of on a journey. And I kind of felt when I first started 10 years ago getting interested, I started calling it my spiritual shift, which sounds really funny now because when all of a sudden I got interested in starting reading about it and getting interested, I kind of felt like I was being enlightened a little bit. I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't know all these things. I never knew that this world existed. And now that it's 10 years later and I have even more questions and have changed my mind and changed my beliefs on a whole bunch of things too. Enlightenment sounds funny to say that, but I do still tend to call it my spiritual shift, and I've been on it for 10 years and it keeps going. So maybe some of you can relate to me on that. To complicate my journey, I am typically 50% complete believer and 50% skeptic, and that really sucks. Is anybody else in that camp? I really want everything to be paranormal. I really, really, really do. And as much as I try to block the other side, there's the part that's like, but did they have their phone on? And was there something else in the environment? Could it really have been this? And by the time I argue with myself for 30 minutes, I just get tired of even thinking about it. I'm like, okay, forget it. So you'll hear kind of that attitude throughout here too, because I really do want things to be paranormal. It's like I've got this little person on my shoulder that says, you're crazy. What are you thinking? So I made the final decision to title my presentation, Becoming a Paranerd, and probably Mr. Taylor could talk about this since subtitles are so popular these days. We'll call it a brief tour through my paranormal world. So here we go. For me, it all started, and I'm not ashamed to say it, it all started with a paranormal TV show and a book. And I've talked to so many paranormal investigators and researchers that are like, oh, there's a show called Ghost Hunters. Oh, I've never heard of it. I don't watch it. And I'm like, really? Because after the week Ghost Hunters came on the scene, like in 2005, all of a sudden there were 500,000 paranormal teams. So I think a lot of researchers are kind of in denial about that. And they probably would never want to admit that their education was a TV show. And, my whole education was not a TV show, but that was part of it, and that was the beginning. Some of those early seasons of Ghost Hunters were so much better than they are now. They seemed a little more real. and authentic and seemed to be in it for the reasons they were saying they were. And now I think it's just kind of a big production, for a studio. But as many times as I'll criticize them, I'll be sucked in and I'll watch every single one of them, and I do. Every season, even if I'm yawning and falling asleep, I'm there and I'm watching it. But that really, combined with this book, James Van Praagh's Ghosts Among Us, kicked it off for me. It was like instantly. Looking back, this book might not even be a very good book. I don't know. It was 10 years ago, but it was the first, and that's what got it started. I often wonder if I should go back and read it again and see kind of where my thoughts are with it now that it's 10 years later. But I remember I was in a Borders, and I had a handful of books already. I caught this book in a time when I was just starting to read a lot. I grew up hating to read. I never read, even when I was supposed to, probably through high school, through college. And that's weird to say as a teacher, but I admit that, and I tell my students that too. And all of a sudden, somebody convinced me, about a year before this happened, someone convinced me to read this book that was in a series, the Tales of the City series. And all of a sudden, I was addicted. That's all it took. And so for a year, I read about a book a week. And I was very, religious about it. And I had, this shelving ceremony after it. I was like, oh, and I put the book on this shelf and was so very proud of it. And this book was about a year later, and that ended my relationship with fiction books. And since then, almost 100% of the time, any book I'm reading is nonfiction on paranormal or spiritual topics. So my obsession with books was on topics on life on the other side, channeling. I began trying channeling, which was a weird thing to jump into when you're just getting into the paranormal. So I probably did that backwards, and I failed at it, but it was interesting and fun. I even took a class on it. Mediumship. I am a sucker for a good book by a psychic or a medium. Even if it's a bad book, I will sit there and read it and probably love every second of it. Sylvia Browne. Even though I think there's a lot of criticism that is valid for Sylvia Browne, something about her books, I just get sucked into Sylvia Browne books. And I love them. And the one about life on the other side, for sure. I think that was the first one I read. And I still think back, when I'm interviewing somebody on my show, and that's one of my most popular questions. I'll say, what have you learned about life on the other side? Well, that book, man, whether it's true or not, she's got some crazy pictures of, and descriptions of what it's really like. Spirit communication is really one of my big nerdy areas, especially EVP, that I'll talk about a little bit in a few minutes. Early days of spiritualism, the Fox sisters, seances, that'll get me sucked in. And then paranormal investigation, ghost hunting, that type of thing. For a year or two, I was flying through books so fast on these topics. I'm not even sure I sucked all the information in, correctly, like I should. I probably should have sat with it more and really reflected on it, but I couldn't stop. It's really probably an addiction. Kind of like podcasting, maybe. That's probably an addiction too. We'll see. I might be taking therapy later. So I have 3 pages of recommended reading on here just because that's how it fit. And I'm not going to go through and read them, but when my presentation's over, if anybody is interested or wants to, we can go back and show these slides. I also have this on my website, and I slimmed it down a little bit. I've got a few more titles on the website, but and not all of them are intellectual type books. It's just the ones that really I loved and I remember and got a lot out of. Those are on there. So the next thing on the journey that got me going is a podcast called the Paranormal Podcast with Jim Harold. How many of you have heard that podcast? It was one of the very first podcasts on the topic of the paranormal. And he started in 2005, this podcast. He wasn't super regular in the beginning, but 2008 is when I first started listening. And that's when he really got serious about it and interviewed tons of people. And it was my very first podcast that I'd ever heard. And it was the only podcast that I listened to actually for several years. And I would sit at home and usually the day that he would release it, I'd sit there and I'd wait for it and get so excited. And if he didn't release a podcast one week, I'd be so annoyed because it was like what I did on my weekends, listening to the podcast. Jim's podcast was truly the beginning of an education for me in the paranormal. And it kind of paired up well with all of the books that I was reading. A lot of the early episodes I feel are just valuable, so valuable and truly evergreen. And to this day, I'll go back and I'll listen to some episodes again. It really was, a lot of people talk about the years ago Coast to Coast AM, a lot of those shows. This is kind of my Coast to Coast AM. Episodes with Troy Taylor. Troy was even on Jim Harold's podcast, Lloyd Auerbach and Rosemary Ellen Guiley, Michelle Belanger, Annie Wilder and her book, House of Spirits and Whispers. Anybody read that book? That's a really cool book. Jeff Belanger, Leslie Bannatyne, who is a Halloween expert and historian. And I really nerd out on Halloween too. I know there's probably a couple of you out there that do that. Karen A. Dahlman is now one of my favorite guests who returns to my podcast. And I first heard her on Jim Harold's podcast. He is actually the one who told me, you know what, I think you could do this. Have you thought about doing a podcast? And that's crazy as a paranormal podcaster that he would suggest that to me because he knew that my podcast would be on the paranormal. So he makes jokes about me being his competition, but I'm so not his competition. He's got tons of listeners. But he, in the early days, 2.5 years ago, he was very much a mentor of mine. So that was in 2008. And then in 2010, I was so furiously going through books and topics. And I thought, you know what? I need to form a paranormal investigation team. And it was my family. And we called it Missouri Spirit Seekers. And looking back now, that name, I don't know, that name makes me want to cringe. It just seems really cheesy and dorky. But that's what we were. And they followed me on the journey. They encouraged me on it. It's my mom and my dad, my sister and her wife. And I really got into planning it, organizing it, getting the website together, doing the research to put forms together. How do you interview a client? What outcome do you want? How do you investigate? And we just jumped in. I spent way too much money than I should have. All my tax returns for 3 years, on equipment and cameras and devices and stuff. And it was really fun. And then the next slide, how many of you have made fun of paranormal teams' photos? They have some really funny photos, some of them. And, sometimes people call paranormal teams the Black Shirt Society because they've all got a black shirt. They've all got their logo. Where I've got a really funny photo on the next slide that we took. So I figured I would humble myself and show you that. I don't know what we were thinking. There was a cornfield there and we just decided to do it. So that's the humorous break for this presentation. There's our black shirts. You got to have a black shirt if you're on a paranormal team. We didn't have a ton of investigations. And thankfully we didn't, because whenever I would do an investigation, it would take me 4 months to get through it all and really dig in and analyze things. And I'm OCD by nature. And so that's really tough. I'm also kind of a control freak with things like this. And it worked out because my family was really there for the fun of it. And then I did everything behind the scenes. And when you're already a teacher and you're stressed and you're not sleeping very well and you're into this, I didn't sleep very much for a couple of years, nodding off at the desk, looking at video, the same screen that doesn't change, and you're looking at dust flying around. And but audio, EVP was most of the evidence that I feel we got. We had fun though. I'd say we had probably 20, maybe, investigations. Some of it was just a few of us. Some of it was just on my own. And most of it, honestly, is undisclosed things. So I can't really talk specifically about a lot of them. We investigated a couple of school campuses. One of them, a large kind of university campus. And learned a lot. Had some really cool experiences. Got some cool screenshots. some cool pictures. I also was asked to help with Joplin Paranormal Research Society in Joplin, Missouri. They're a really cool group, so I got to go to places like Fort Chaffee Prison. It's been on, all of the shows and a couple other places. So that's that. So much fun. More education. Not a ton of true paranormal evidence, but pages and pages and pages of reports and data. But nothing that I would say, I am absolutely confident this is paranormal. And part of that might be, the skeptic part of my brain, whereas someone else would have a whole page of evidence. That's not me. So that kind of wore me out a little bit. That very first EVP really, really sucks you in. How many of you have your own EVP from something? Oh my gosh, as soon as you get that EVP, you can't, back away. So that really, really was another stepping stone in my journey. And this is Friedan's United Church of Christ in St. Charles, Missouri. And this investigation, I think, was in 2010. This was actually only our second investigation. And it's really unusual for a church to call a paranormal team and say, oh yeah, we'll let you put it on your website. Share all about it. We've got paranormal experiences here. So it was really cool. We had 2 different investigations there, and at the end, a couple months later, they pulled together a fellowship supper, and the congregation got together, and they were like, okay, we're ready for your report. And I was like, shut up, this is so cool for a church to do that. But we got really one main. They have, I guess I should tell you their experiences. First of all, this church is the 4th church that is on that land. And so the first church was built in 1834. I think they had a few fires, things like that. And then there's also a cemetery that started the same year that is on the property right next door. They had 13 deaths on the property due to cholera, apparently, based on records that they found. Their experiences have been footsteps, hearing voices, a stereo in one of the offices that turns itself on at certain times of the evening. And then a few people have seen a gray, misty apparition. So those were their experiences that they came to us with. And we're very open to whatever we wanted to try. The first investigation that we went to, we ended up getting the CVP. So in just a second, we'll try to listen to that if I put my microphone up there. We were in the basement of the fellowship hall. Nothing really special going on. Nothing really special about the fellowship hall. Just kind of a typical, place where people gather together for their meals or whatever in the basement. And you're going to hear me just kind of saying numbers because I'm looking at the meter, taking readings. There's a kitchen, just kind of like would be over there, a kitchen that there's a few noises coming out of the kitchen, like from a fridge or something. And when you hear that first initial loud noise, you're going to think, oh my gosh, that's the devil. It's a noise from the kitchen. The EVP is actually after that. I have usually thought that it's okay to manipulate your EVPs, amplify them, make them slower, providing you kind of have the follow, leave all of them. You have the original and kind of include each step kind of as a reference. And so I know some people are not into kind of enhancing the EVPs, but I have all of them here. That first one, you might not hear it, especially here, but I debated whether to go ahead and tell you what I thought it said, but we've kind of agreed that it says, it's all over me, or it's all over. Some people have heard some other things I won't tell you. I guess I'll let you kind of think. But we'll go through each one. Again, we might not hear it. I'll raise my hand when I hear the EVP so that you can kind of be listening for it.
Side of the fellowship hall, opposite of the kitchen, it's higher numbers. And then you go to the center, it's like...
Okay, so you probably didn't hear that, and it's not very loud. But noise reduction is going to probably be a little quieter. That might be pointless, but we'll go ahead and listen to it anyway. It's the extraneous noise kind of pulled out of the file.
Side of the fellowship hall, opposite of the kitchen, it's higher numbers. And And then you go to the center, it's like...
Next one, you're more likely to hear it. This is the same noise reduction with some amplification on the part that has what I'm assuming is a voice.
Side of the fellowship hall, opposite of the kitchen, it's higher numbers. And then you go to the center, it's like...
Are you hearing it now? Okay. Now this next one, because it's slowed down, is going to make you think that there's a demonic presence or something, especially if you watch Ghost Adventures. But it's just that it's slowed down. But this is when I think really, the it's all over me, if that's what you think it says, pops out. So same thing, all the same stuff, just slowed down now.
Side of the fellowship hall, opposite of the kitchen, it's higher numbers. And then you go to the center, it's like...
Typically, when you listen to EVP, the standard is for you to listen with earbuds or headphones. So if you were to have earbuds or headphones, you'd hear that way more. And I know there's probably some skeptic people in here, and that's okay, at least about EVPs, because I hear other people's EVPs all the time, and I'm like, right. Somebody burped or, is a heavy smoker and is wheezing or something like that. So trust me, I don't fight people when they argue about my EVPs because I'm just as skeptical about others. So that was big for me. That changed a lot, and that affected kind of some of the next few slides that you're going to hear. So then I started experiencing burnout from trying to do it all myself with the data and charts and color-coded things, pages and pages of reports. On the right, that would just be one of my folders of audio files, trying to keep track of them, trying to figure out what to name them and how to not lose them, and what do you need to keep and what do you delete. Maybe later you find something that, truly would be paranormal, but you've already deleted it, So I went through some of that. The skeptic part of my brain made that kind of tough too. People eventually stopped calling, and I took that as my sign that, maybe I need to step back. Maybe I've had this experience, and so that I don't die, I'm going to maybe get some rest and not do so much of that. So then we kind of went inactive. And so my next outlet was bigseance.com. And so this was my blog, and for a couple of years, there for a while I was blogging every day about haunted places I've gone to, genealogy I've done, things like the Skull Experiment, different books that I've read. I did a cemetery grave adoption a couple of times that I was really proud of, that I thought was cool. So I did that for a couple of years, met a lot of people, a lot of readers that I made friends with, again, networking with researchers and authors that people were contacting me. And then I did some EVP research. I did some really heavy EVP experiments for several weeks after I read a book by Sarah Estep, who is like the pioneer of EVP for America, anyway, in the 70s, 60s, 70s, I think. In 1984 or 82, I forget which one. In 82, she formed the American Association for Electronic Voice Phenomena. They called it AAEVP. Now it's the Association Trans Communication. They call it ATRANS-C. And Tom and Lisa Butler are now the directors of that. They have this awesome book called There Is No Death and There Are No Dead. And between that book and Sarah's book, which is called Voices of Eternity, it's actually a free book. You can get it online. It inspired me to do all of that EVP experimenting from home. Never thought my home was haunted. It wasn't. But it was my opinion that, if you really try hard enough, you could possibly get communication from wherever, from the other side. If you tune in, supposedly there's if you really want to go that far, stations on the other side that they're just waiting to communicate and reach out. I got my 2-week experiment report that I did published in the ATRANS-C newsletter, which is a worldwide newsletter. And one of the other cool experiences, I guess I'll go to my next screen. I'm trying to speed up. Was I have experience from my rapper, and I don't mean Tupac. While doing EVP experiments, all of a sudden there were 3 different visits in about a week or 2 week time period where I got really, what I felt was really obvious communication by knocking or rapping in the room around me. And, when you live in your house for a couple of years, you start getting used to the noises and used to the taps and the pops. So you think about it for a little bit. These were obvious. And I don't have audio here, but it's on my website. One of the coolest experiences I've had. And I just wanted to mention that in those sessions, that's a time period I was reading about the Fox sisters and Sarah Estep. And there are several places in the audio, the documentation, where I ask if they're with me or invite them to come help me with the experiment. And all of a sudden, boom, the knocks get louder and are more pronounced. And I'm like, I don't know. Who was that? Could they have been helping me out, or is it somebody else? So I just wanted to mention that. I pulled back more and got into cemetery photography, which was my, another big obsession I just got into. And it's a relaxation for me. I can spend hours and hours doing cemetery photography. So I won't talk too much about that. I was inspired by a woman named Mary Homick, who does amazing professional cemetery photography. I have a Flickr page. It's linked on my website where I have tons and tons of photos from different cemeteries, mainly, in the St. Louis area, but there's some other ones, like in New Orleans and things like that. So then I moved on to my own podcast that, Jim Harold kind of mentored me and inspired me. And you can get this podcast on iTunes, Google Play Music, iHeartRadio, TuneIn Radio, Stitcher, and then you could also do it old school and go right to bigseance.com and hear every episode. There tend to be about an hour on average every other week, like Troy said. Sometimes it's episodes just with me talking about nerdy things I'm doing, books I'm reading, or experiments that I've done. Most of the time it's an interview. And, Troy has been one of those interviews. And before we try the video, the last screen is just, if you were interested, if you're on social media a lot, you can find The Big Seance on Twitter. And on Facebook, we're called The Big Seance. And we have a Facebook group for all of my Paranerds who like to follow the podcast. And it's called The Big Seance Parlor. So there's lots of, if people want to go there to have more discussion and follow up on things in the podcast, that's where you can go to. And then my site is bigseance.com. I'll also put, in my pocket, I've got some more cards. I'll put the cards out here on the table. So those are my business cards. Well, business cards, because I so don't make any money on the Big Seance podcast. Okay, so I guess I've got the video. And I really am proud of this video because I look back now all of a sudden and I'm pulling up old interviews from the last 2.5 years and I was like, wow, that was cool. And I remember that. And it's really a cool conversation that you have with, experts in this field. And even some regular people who I've kind of made friends with and learned that they were nerdy about the paranormal. Yeah, I'll step over here and put the microphone up to it.
At this point, I shared the highlights video that I created recently. I'm going to go ahead and play the audio for the first part of that video, but the end is just music as I flash photos of various past guests up on the screen. So I'll cut that out before that spot. I'll put the link to the actual highlights video in the show notes, so you can check that out if you'd like. So again, here's the audio to the first part of the highlights video.
I just find that when you're looking for actual evidence of a place being haunted, it seems like you can find out more using the history of it than you can using any kind of electronic stuff.
The question remains open in terms of whether or not we can ever rehabilitate the Ouija board, so to speak, as it's been so thoroughly trashed and demonized by the media, by Hollywood, and by, frankly, people who haven't got a clue what they're talking about.
They just turned up one day, and I left as soon as I could because I just didn't like them.
Yeah.
I thought Ed Warren was a complete BS specialist. Lorraine was fairly harmless, but I didn't speak to her, so I can't comment. But all I remember was Ed Warren telling me that either he or I could make a lot of money out of the case, and I pointed out that that's not why we were there.
It was the split second I said that, try calling upon the name of Jesus, that slammed down with tremendous force. And one of the girls, her head flew to the side. She'd been slapped on the left side of her head. Lorraine came in and said, there is a spirit here, it's Bathsheba, this family's in danger, and they had a private conference with Roger and Carolyn, and that's when they said that Pyro has to leave. So.
But there came a night where, it was after the exorcism actually, where there was screaming. I mean, it woke us up at 5 in the morning. It was the worst thing. It was probably the only moment ever that maybe scared me, really scared me. The next thing I knew was I received a phone call from Carol Simpson. NBC came in, and it became the first ever televised paranormal event that was ever taken seriously. But if you look in that YouTube piece, there'll be a dark doorway. You're gonna see a ghost start to come out and go back in.
Wow. I woke up and I heard the door was open to the room, and I had heard the carpet shuffling, and I looked, and it was a little girl, and I thought it was my sister, and it was a little girl, and she looked at me and she put her finger to her mouth and was like, shh, like kind of like, be quiet.
I was always interested in the news. I mean, I remember, I'm in my mid-40s, I remember watching Walter Cronkite, and that's the way it is. And probably like the only 8-year-old kid that I knew who watched Meet the Press. My mom used to say I would walk around the house with a flashlight saying, I'm Bob Barker.
So you guys, I did some of this stuff for you, so you don't have to.
But you said that you don't regret it, though, right?
No, I don't regret it. It was the most painful thing I've ever done. It was, but then I was willing to go back. You know, I went back for another. I was going to go 5 times. Listen, well, I spent the money and I got a great chapter out of it, at least.
Like when I was a little kid, I'd be confused. I'd come downstairs in the middle of the night and say to my mom and dad things like, I want to go home now. And they'd be like, you are home. What do you mean? And when I was in college, I thought I was insane when I lived in the dorms or in apartments because I had all of these emotions that were related to nothing that was going on in my life. And it wasn't until I moved to a house in the woods off by myself that it stopped. And I realized, oh, wait, these were other people's things.
And, you know, my goal, in addition to being a psychic medium, is I'm April. I'm a person. And I have a family, and I have a life, and I have a path that I'm trying to figure out. And, you know, if I don't balance myself, my mind, my body, my soul, sometimes I do a really good job. Sometimes I flub it up a lot. But if I don't balance me, I'm not going to be a good intuitive. You know, they don't ever want to talk about, remember that time you stole my money, you hole? They always talk about, you know, they never say that. They always talk about those moments that took our breath away, not the moments that we lost our breath.
She was a really intelligent little girl, and she looked at me and she said, are ghosts real? And I said, yes, ghosts are real, but most all of the time they're not going to hurt you. They're very friendly. And she looked at her mother and she smacked her on the, you know, like on the hip, and she said, see, I told you they were real. But it kind of ended funny because she goes, do ghosts like bananas? And I said, no, I don't think they like bananas. And she goes, that's why they're not eating my bananas. And the mom's like, that's why you have bananas in your closet?
You wake up and you have an overwhelming emotional sense that person has been with you. I firmly believe that they wait on that other side of the veil for opportunities to step in and help us. You know, I dreamed about pancakes. What does that mean?
I've got a ghost report here that shows that sometimes these ghost reports would serve more as filler than actual hardcore news items. This one gets pretty romantic. I'm Tim Prasil, and you've been listening to the audio version of Spectral Edition. I have close to 300 of these ghost reports, all of them authentic articles published in U.S. newspapers between the years of 1865 and 1918.
You should right now see the Ouija board on the table. And so once we get rolling there, I'll switch to that screen.
W H O D O N. Oh, they have a lot to say. T.
He also just said what was communicated made perfect sense. He just said that. There you go. Validation.
More importantly, you are okay. She is not only fine but thriving. You would only recognize her spirit, not her struggles. Not that she had, for she had none, but rather the struggles you had. Let them go for your sake, not hers. What do you think should be? Tell them about my book, Jack.
That was what happened.
Jack came in. My cat.
Who's Jack?
My cat. He's writing a book.
Welcome to the Big Seance Podcast.
So that's it. And I just hope maybe if you think there's a small chance that you're a Paranerd, that you'll check it out either by going to bigseance.com or on iTunes or your podcast app or wherever. And then the last thing I'll say in the back of the room is my partner Joe, who is so not a Paranerd, but he's very supportive anyway and doesn't think I'm completely cray-cray. So I want to thank him for being supportive and helping me out today. I was so very nervous, first time speaking about this. But I went a little bit late, Mr. Taylor, so I apologize. Thank you so very much. This has been awesome. You guys rock.
Thanks for joining us for the Big Seance Podcast. We'd better get back to the table while there's still some candlelight left.
On February 5th, 2014, it was my second anniversary of my blog. In honor of that day, I wrote a blog post titled 15 Reasons to Befriend a Paranormal Nerd Today. I had forgotten all about this post, but the presentation you just heard brought it back to my memory. And since I still think it's funny, I decided to revisit it. So here we go. The top 15 reasons to befriend a paranormal nerd, aka Paranerd. Number 1. As we tend to be very open-minded, we don't think you're crazy when you tell us about your experiences. But depending on what subgroup of the paranormal we belong to, don't be offended when we set out on a mission to debunk it. Number 2, think you have a ghost or spirit trying to contact you? We're likely to have a plethora of meters and gadgets to help make that connection, and we can't wait to show you how it all works. And if our gadgets don't spark a conversation, we've always got plenty of friends who claim to be sensitive. Number 3, according to my friend Tim, we know whether it's time to buy a new lamp, or if Aunt Matilda's threat to haunt you was legit. Oh, Tim, does this come from experience? That's really what I said in the blog. Number 4, we can help to explain our favorite acronym lingo, such as EVP, ITC, EMF, IR, UV, OBE, ADC, DBE, ESP, PK, K2, and MG. Do you know what all those are? I almost forgot about a few of those, but they all came back to me. Number 5, on a serious note, according to Rachel, they are intuitive and empathic. I think these are the Paranerd friends. They are intuitive and empathic. They don't see the world in black and white. They see many more colors. Plus, there is a sense of peace about them. Maybe it's because they have some insight on the afterlife. I absolutely love Rachel's way with words. Number 6, are you at a party or with a group of people who tend to be on the boring side? That awkward silence doesn't bother us, Paranerds. We're used to carrying on conversations with ghosts that typically don't answer back. Therefore, we don't easily get bored. Though we'll likely keep the conversation going. Don't be offended if we accidentally blurt something like, "If you can hear me, knock 3 times," or "How did you die?" Number 7. Are small animals disappearing from your neighborhood? Have no fear. We're on it, and we know exactly what a Bigfoot call sounds like. That one actually doesn't resonate with me, but I guess I wanted to just represent for the Bigfoot nerds out there. Number 8. We'll be the first to tell you that your no good, horrible, very bad day was not your fault, because Mercury is in retrograde. Number 9. We'll prove or disprove the orb photo taken at your nephew's birthday party in no time flat. The ones who know what they're talking about will tell you that even though it appears to have a face inside, or devil horns, or a personality, or like to be called Beverly, there are 11,000 likely explanations for it, and then let you decide for yourself. Number 10. We paranormal people, who are also investigators, are often willing to invite others to the next big investigation, and we can't wait to share our favorite stories or our Class A EVP. Number 11. Not feeling well? Going through a bad experience? We can break out the crystals and send you rooms full of love and light. Number 12. We know how to begin the research to learn the history of your home, or genealogy research to learn about your ancestors. Number 13. Ever suspect your family pet of learning how to access the refrigerator while you're sleeping? We've got the night vision cameras. Just ask us. Number 14. Need sage for house blessings or clearing? We know just where to get it. And last, number 15, need to borrow a black shirt, polo, or hoodie? Take your pick. Oh, sorry, here's some tape to cover up that logo. Oh, I think I'm so funny. Well, there you have it, folks. If you have any other ideas about how to befriend a paranormal nerd, maybe you should send them to me. I just thought about that. The next time you hear from me, it will be October. And first up in October will be my interview with Chuck Gotsky, sometimes known as Chucky G. Happy autumn, everybody.
For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit bigseance.com. Just click on the Big Seance Podcast logo or find it in the menu. You can also find and subscribe to the show in iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, TuneIn Radio, and iHeartRadio. Do you have any comments or feedback? Go to bigseance.com/feedback to learn how to get your voice in a future show. Or you can call my feedback line, 7755-TELL-ME. That's 775-583-5563. Interested in learning how to promote and share the podcast? Go to bigseance.com/share. Thank you so much for listening. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time.